Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today in a legal update as well as a Q&A session for owners and operators and managers addressing the latest legal developments impacting the self-storage industry. My name is Eric Airy. I'm Executive Director of the New York Self-Storage Association. I will be monitoring questions submitted by today's attendees. We are recording today's event and we'll have it posted on the NYSSA website next week. We have with us today Mark Kunkin, attorney from Hill Rivkins, Joseph Miller, attorney from Miller & Lee LLP, Adam Steckler, president, Manhattan Mini Storage, and our moderator and New York Self-Storage Association board member, James Coakley. Our panelists will discuss the latest developments regarding COVID-19 and self-storage. All participants have been muted upon entry. We ask you please to stay muted throughout the entire presentation. The attendees control bar can be found at the bottom of your screen. Here you can adjust your audio settings and connect through your computer's audio headset or connect speakers. This is also where you will participate in the Q&A by sending your questions, and we will keep the identities anonymous. In the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you can adjust your video settings to view this webinar in full screen mode and adjust your view to see the speaker all panelists at once. We would like to thank our corporate partners, CubeSmart, Extra Space, and Public Storage for making events like this possible through their support. We will follow with a Q&A session as time permits. I now hand it over to our moderator, James Coakley.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate that introduction and welcome everybody. It's our honor and pleasure to have you with us today. We all certainly wish these were under different circumstances, be that as it may. These are important times that we're all on the same page as an association and as an industry. So we thank you all for attending this webinar. And we'd also like to thank Eric and his team for putting the webinar together in such short order. We're all concerned about COVID-19 and its impacts on the self-storage industry. In the absence of information, sometimes we tend to leap to the worst case scenario, so that we as a group thought that this session would certainly help us all achieve clarity on what is known and what is unknown, what may be speculation or even exaggeration. This is an important topic that is affecting all of our lives as well as all of our businesses. So we're again honored to create this webinar today to share what we know as an industry, to answer many of the questions that you may have. And a lot of the questions we're going to pose today were directly results or posed by members to the association, either via email or calls in to Eric and his team. So we certainly thank you for that. When you have questions and you do raise them to the association, it only helps us serve our members better. So we certainly thank you for that, and we'd ask that you keep doing that in the future. Lastly, we'll give you some tools and operating practices, as well as some talking points to share with your employees and your customers. As the panel moderator, I'll be guiding us through the process. We have about an hour together to spend, so we're going to try to get to as many topics in as much depth as we possibly can. So during the webinar, please be sure to submit your questions using the chat feature, and Eric and his team will do their best to collate those and make sure that we're not duplicating efforts, but also getting to as many of the questions we have. With that, it's my honor to introduce our panel today. First, as Eric said, we have Mark Kunkin, who's an attorney at Hill Rivkins LLP. Mark regularly appears before federal courts, state courts, and administrative agencies to protect the interests of the self-storage operators in a wide array of issues, ranging from lien law violations, general business law violations, breach of contract claims, and consumer fraud claims. Mark's practice includes drafting occupancy agreements and protection plans. Mark regularly works with clients to ensure compliance with lien law regulations as well as all applicable rules and regulations. He advises clients on the scope of their insurance coverage and drafts a variety of other agreements used by operators to meet their own specific needs. Our second panelist today is Joseph Miller. Joe is also an attorney and founding member of Miller and Lee LLP, located in Westchester, New York. He is generally recognized as one of the leading legal authorities on New York self-storage law. He has extensive experience representing self-storage companies ranging from drafting contracts to advising on tenant matters to defending civil lawsuits and administrative proceedings. Joe is a frequent lecturer and panelist for our NYSSA conventions and is in the forefront of litigating the legal issues that shape the self-storage industry in New York. Our final panelist today is Adam Steckler. Adam serves as the president of Manhattan Mini Storage, where he has worked for over the past 6 years. Manhattan Mini Storage is an owner-operator with over 50,000 units across 17 locations in New York City. So I welcome all the panelists today. It's a pleasure to be with you guys. As we get into the questions for the panelists, I just certainly ask that we all keep in mind that the information provided during this webinar does not and is not intended to constitute legal advice. All the information discussed and provided during the webinar are really for general informational purposes. We always encourage our members to discuss their own particular situations with their own attorneys. And if you don't have one, we have two pretty good guys on the panel today. So with that, we're going to get right into the questions and answers. So the first question we have up today for the panelists is, what should we know about price increases during the COVID-19 crisis? And with prices, I think we talk about two types. That's our first being our street and our market prices that we advertise, and then the increases that we may do to our current tenant rates. So Mark, you're on top of my screen, so I'm going to start with you first. What should we know about price increases during the COVID-19 crisis?
Thank you, James. This is a popular question that I've been getting a lot. And New York doesn't give much guidance. I think that's part of why we hear this question a lot. Under New York law, the GBL 396-R, the standard is that you can't charge an unconscionably excessive price. If you look further, they'll talk about how it can't be grossly higher than before the incident or the affected cause, nor can it be grossly higher than others in the affected area. Other than that, it doesn't specifically address guidance. If we look to the newspapers last week, a Long Island man was charged with price gouging by the feds, but he started his markups at 59%. I think we could all agree that is price gouging. If we look at other states, neighboring states like New Jersey, their statute says 10% would be considered price gouging. So I think you have to be very cautious. You have to tread carefully. You don't want to be seen taking advantage. And I would look at the states that actually put a number on it in our area, and I wouldn't exceed the 10%, assuming that you're going to increase prices at all in these times.
So Mark, you raised an interesting term there called, price gouging. Joe, could you let us know, exactly what, price gouging is, and is there a difference during, the quote unquote normal times versus, this executive order that we're under now from the governor of New York?
Sure. And just give it, without sticking to a technical term here, I'll give you just a basic term, and Mark used it, raising a price which is unreasonably unconscionable. There is different, the law does draw a distinction between regular times and specifically in times like now, when there is an abnormal disruption of the market caused by a strike, power failure, shortage, or adverse circumstance. Reading right out of the statute on that one. This is going to constitute one of those times and periods. Just following up on one point, Mark made a great point with the 10%. The New York City Consumer Affairs recently amended one of their statutes to indicate that it's illegal to raise prices more than 10%, as well as services. And they define certain specific items because the New York City Department of Consumer Affairs loves to use services, and it always brings the self-storage industry into this fight as to whether we're providing a service. So I agree with Mark, don't go above 10%. You've got specific guidance in New York City right now. That helps.
Sure. Thanks, Joe. I think, we're all kind of on that same, guideline there. And from a business perspective, Adam, can you tell us a little bit about how you guys are addressing your rate structure and your price increases and stuff like that? And, this might be a little bit more, subjective to how you guys are running your business, but hopefully it helps give some best practice to those folks that are listening in today.
Yeah, thank you, James. Again, this is just what we're doing. Doesn't mean that you want to do it the same way, but it's really broken into two groups. Like you said, we have our existing customers who would be up in some regular cycle for rate increases. Once the pandemic started, we suspended all rate increases. So no customers who've been existing customers are getting a rate increase. And it looks like we'll probably be doing that until the pandemic is over. Regarding our new customer pricing or street pricing, as you referred to it before, we've been very careful just based on the timing of the pandemic. Our pricing was pretty low anyway, coming out of the winter. Student season really hadn't started yet. Even when we did see a big rush of students right when the pandemic started, we were very careful to make sure that no individual location or group, that we kept all the rate increases less than 10% in that category. So we were extremely careful so we wouldn't be perceived as price gouging in any way.
Good. Okay. Thank you, Adam.
James, can I make one quick point on this with price gouging?
For sure.
There's a lot of people. This is more with respect to products. So if you're selling tape or whatnot, obviously your distributor may be increasing the price dramatically just because his supply, it's a supply and demand. So at least with the New York City regulation, when they increased it, they did specifically state that if you're increasing it exponentially because your supplier is increasing it exponentially to you, that's not necessarily going to be a price gouging issue.
Understood. And I think that's a good distinction to make, product versus, the storage unit or the service we provide as an operator. Obviously, we control the inventory of storage units within our facilities. So I'm not sure that would qualify as a product being increased from a distributor or another supplier. So thanks for that distinction. I think that's very important. The next question we have today for our panel, following suit to price increases, would be: can we still charge late fees during the COVID-19 pandemic? And obviously considering the language that's in our occupancy agreements now. So Joe, let me start with you on that one.
Sure, I'll give you a very brief answer and then I'll explain it to you. Brief answer is yes, you can charge late fees. Now in Executive Order 202.8, which is what seems to be causing everybody the headaches interpreting it, the governor said you cannot evict somebody, and he said you cannot foreclose upon somebody. There's a little, obviously, dispute here with that language later. But in none of his executive orders, specifically 202.8, did he say that you cannot charge late fees. In fact, the governor's subsequent advice or advice coming from the Economic Development Committee has specifically said, although you can't be evicted for 90 days, it doesn't mean you don't have to pay your rent for 90 days. And there's specific to various industries, they carve out where you can't charge late fees. It does not apply to the rental of real property. It does not apply to the rental of self-storage facility, which obviously is the rental of real property. So the brief answer is yes, you can charge late fees.
Great. Thanks. Mark, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Like non-COVID times, before you charge late fee, make sure it is in your occupancy agreement. The rights haven't changed. You don't have increased rights. So if it's not in there, I would be reluctant to charge a late fee. If it's in there, then charge it according to that if you want to collect it at this time. Not everybody is doing that. As Joe said, the New York moratorium does not address or prohibit late fees in this instance in New York. Other states have done that. New York has not. So it's up to each operator.
Thank you, Mark. And Adam, from a business operator's perspective, with, as I think we said, over 50,000 customers, what is your take and what's your process at this point as it's related to charging customers late fees?
Yeah, this has certainly been a big debate for us. At this time, yes, we are still charging and applying late fees to customers' accounts. However, it is one of the first things, it is the very first thing that we will waive if a customer comes to us, has a hardship, can't make payment, needs to work out a payment plan. We'll get into this later, I know, in the questions about what an AR payment plan or AR collection process looks like. But we are charging the late fee, but it is, again, it's flexibility, talking to the customer, and it is one of the first things we'll waive in the process.
And with that charging, you obviously haven't deviated from your process as far as how you notify the customer that they are late and that a fee may or may not have been applied, correct?
Correct. They'll still see it on their invoice in that process. So it's all still there. If they contact us again, like I said, we'll easily waive it in the system. But yes, it is transparent and the customer see it.
So as we continue to move through, I guess the tenant delinquency phases, question that we are getting quite a bit is, can we conduct lien sales during this time? And I just want to preface this by saying we're going to discuss pros and cons later in the program, and we're really just going to talk first now about the legal guidance or the legal side on this, and then we'll get into the business perspective down the line. So Mark, let's go back to you. And can we conduct lien sales during this time?
I haven't seen a uniform answer on this. We all have our own beliefs. For instance, I know the SSA for quite a while was putting out advisories saying in New York, you cannot. They've since backtracked off of that, and they've changed it to a recommendation, which I think Joe and I both agree with, that you shouldn't. There is no per se prohibition against the lien sales. There are other obstacles that you can no longer satisfy, though, if you wanted to. One of the things the lien law requires is that you provide time so your tenant can go to court for a special proceeding to challenge it. Right now, the courts are closed to such filings until tomorrow, and we have to wait to see whether or not that's going to be extended or how they're going to open. Are they going to open up fully at once, or is it going to be a soft opening first? We don't currently know how they're going to do it. They've been taking steps to open up, but they're definitely not fully operational yet. Two, even if you wanted to sell somebody at this time, how do you do it in a commercially reasonable manner? People are shut in. People aren't supposed to be gathering that closely. Do you have a process in place? Do you believe in online auctions or not? That could get around some of it, but not all of the problems. The other thing is the lien sale itself. I don't think it could be deemed essential. You're supposed to be open for essential business, essential matters. Selling someone's property is not essential. And the other problem with it is that morally, it's just wrong under these times where we are. And I think that's why every operator I know of in this area has not gone ahead with a lien sale yet, and everybody is just waiting.
So I know you kind of gave us a pretty in-depth explanation there, both on what from a legal perspective as well as some business practice. So Joe, I'm going to ask you just to kind of fill in the gaps there, if there's anything that you may have seen or hearing that you can add to what Mark has already shared with us.
Just briefly, as everybody on this panel knows, I've been adamant from day one that there's no direct prohibition against a lien sale under any of the executive orders. Again, it all circles back to the language in 202.8, which essentially states for 90 days an eviction or foreclosure on a mortgage. Neither of those two, in my opinion, apply to self-storage. So there's no direct prohibition. I agree with Mark on all the points he's made. You can make some very valid arguments that that's not part of the essential service we provide. However, there's no direct prohibition against it. Should you do it? We will get into that later. The answer now is no, I don't think you should do it. Mark's raised some great points as far as how do you logistically do it. Obviously, you could do it online, which would get you around the prohibition of the social gathering in 202.9, I think is the executive order. The whole issue of the order to show cause, which is how you would move to stay the lien sale. Mark and me have had different experiences with that. My understanding was that is something that the court would actually not necessarily rule upon, but would consider the order to show cause to stay the lien sale. Mark has had different experiences with that. You also have to remember that with respect to if they wanted to move to stay it, they also have the benefit of going to landlord-tenant court and claiming you're locking them out, which is something we should and we'll discuss later, and you'll deal with that issue. So those are where I would fill it in. I think I agree with Mark that from an academic standpoint, when reviewing these statutes, there is no direct prohibition. Certainly arguments can be made to the other side, but ultimately, as we discuss later, you should not be going forward with lien sales at this exact moment.
Good, thanks, Joe. And I think we did I did kind of skip over a portion of that, and I'll circle back to it. So, Adam, from the business perspective, what's Manhattan Mini Storage doing now when it comes to self-storage auctions or liens sales?
Yeah, the simple answer is we're just not doing it, even if we're permitted. We just don't think it's good business. It's not the right time. Even, I know we touched on auctions a little bit. It's really a self-remedy for the business owner to go through that. Again, it could be maybe the courts would perceive that as sort of being, evading the law in some way. So again, we're just no auctions, no lien sales. All of that's been halted.
Okay. And so Joe brought it up a little bit in his discussion and his explanation there about the lien sale, and I wanted to circle back to it. Can we still overlock units and deny access to delinquent customers? So you had brought it up first, Joe. So let me start with you on that one.
Okay. If you have a lease agreement where you have the right to overlock the unit, then unquestionably, I believe you can overlock the unit. If you don't have a lease agreement which says you have the right to overlock the unit, it's a little murkier because you're then going to have to argue that I'm enforcing my lien law 182 rights, and by virtue of the fact that I have to prevent them from accessing their unit to take it out, I'm overlocking the unit. That's always been an issue if you do or do not have that in your lease, and you should have it in your lease at this point. Again, what you have to be afraid of here, and we've all had this miserable experience, is being dragged into landlord-tenant court with the claim of an illegal lockout because you've overlocked the unit. Now they can't get their property. Circling back, the way it usually plays out is the judges will look at it one of two ways. One, they'll say, do you have a self-help remedy in your agreement? If you do, you're fine because you can lock them out. If you don't have it, then you have to argue it's a lien law 182. There's no specific provision saying you can't lock it out. There's no executive order saying you can't lock it out. You just have to worry about, are they going to say it's a 202.8 eviction? Now, I will draw a distinction between somebody who's been locked out before we had all the executive orders around March 13th or so that they all started to come in. If your person was locked out by that point, it's not even an issue. You don't have to open up and let them in. I think it gets a little murkier when you get into now. Again, I would still say if they're delinquent, you can lock them out. We can talk practical reasons whether you should or shouldn't do that. But I think from a legal perspective, you're on good grounds to be able to lock them out.
So Adam, from a operator, let us know a little bit about what you're doing, and then some of the customer experiences that you've had in the practice.
Yeah, so we are still overlocking. It's part of our process, and with that along comes disabling their access card. So when they try to access the building, we're unique in the sense that we are in an urban environment, and we have these access cards before they use the elevator and go up to another floor. So it really forces a conversation at the desk. That's what we're really trying to encourage, to get the customer to come to the desk, have some conversation. Because we're not proceeding with, the lien process and auctions, most people, the vast majority of people, we are letting them have access to their unit, even if they're overlocked. We'll go with them, we'll provide access. There is a small handful of people who may have been in the eviction process already because they were threatening or some other, we consider them dangerous in some way. The very, very, very small percentage of people who we may not permit access. But even if they're overlocked, we've been, as a business practice, we're being extremely generous in letting people have access.
So Adam, you raised an interesting point about your operation and the types of facilities you have where you're pretty much manned the entire time that folks have access. So Mark, what are some dangers then for the folks who might be in either a more suburban or rural area that have unmanned or extended access for their clients who want to overlock based upon their normal delinquency process?
I think we have to keep in perspective 202.8, the governor's executive order, which is that it wasn't that self-storage is essential. It says self-storage is allowed to operate to support essential businesses. So you can lock somebody out if you have the right in your occupancy agreement, then they're in arrears, yes. However, if that person has to have a way to communicate with you, even if you're in a rural area in an unmanned facility, they must have a way to communicate with you if you lock them out so that they have the opportunity to say whether or not they are essential. Because if it turns out that you locked out a drug rep that has some commodities in a unit that they were going to give to a children's hospital and they had no way of getting in touch with you, that's a loser right off the bat. That is not exactly supporting an essential business.
Sure. So I think the point there then, the takeaway to the conversation is that it's certainly acceptable to follow your overlocking or procedures as they're stated in your occupancy agreement. But certainly we should all be going, taking it the next step to allow some mechanism for a customer to contact us if our sales office is closed at the time they're trying to get us, whether it's a hotline number, a third-party call center number, an email to the owner, something there. But that is a really important thing that we should all, take away from that. Is that kind of what you were thinking there, Mark?
Yes, there has to be some way. Hotline number, phone number is the best. Something manned, not, hey, we'll get back to you in 48 hours.
Okay, thank you for that. So that leads us, into another topic where we have had a couple of conversations. So if a tenant already was in the lien process, prior to the executive order, this pandemic outbreak, what's your thoughts on continuing with the auction in that situation, Mark?
We're now 7 weeks into what the governor is calling his pause. So my gut reaction is that anybody that had started the auction process, the notice date has already come and passed, and this should no longer be a question. But if somehow somebody notices an auction 8 weeks out, then I would say we still have the issues that we addressed above, which is that conducting an auction is not essential. You're violating social distancing. You're encouraging people to come out when they're supposed to be stayed at home. Is that going to be considered commercially reasonable auction? And there's still restricted court access as of today. So I would be hesitant to proceed with an auction.
Thank you. I know we've asked and some fairly pointed questions on these topics, and we've heard some legal response and digging into it. So now I'm just going to pose it to the panel, pretty succinctly. Should we be conducting evictions and auctions? Not do we have the right, should we be doing this? Joe, I saw you smile first, so let me start with you.
From a practical standpoint, and I sort of mimic Mark, because every time we talk about this, I mimic his phrase. From a moral standpoint, no, I don't think you should be doing auctions during this time period. There's a very real practical problem that we have to worry about as a self-storage association, is that, one, the newspaper hears about this, two, the legislature then becomes aware of it, and three, our very hyper-aggressive attorney general decides that she wants to get involved with this. So those are things that I'm very fearful of. The risk benefit, there's no benefit that outweighs the risk. We have I've been suggesting to everybody a very simple procedure. If you really want to send a lien sale notice, send it, but make the sale date outside the expiration of 202.8 for the eviction. So make it June 20th as the sale date. If you have a situation where you're allowed to evict somebody, they certainly can't argue that you can't conduct a lien sale. And to be frank, I think a lot of times the notices are just sent out to try and prompt somebody to do something, to come and get their property or whatnot. So those are my general feelings on that.
Okay. Mark, anything you want to fill in there as well?
At this time, I wouldn't take any overt steps towards evicting somebody or a lien sale. I would even caution against it in conversations, using that as any type of tactic to try and get a resolution. I wouldn't consider the eviction route even the lien sale route until the eviction moratorium expires. And even then, I would definitely make sure that you're looking at both the state and local regulations, as there's many bills pending throughout the US and even in New York City to extend that moratorium. So while the first one was issued by the governor, if there's a second one, it could be issued by any level of government. I'm not saying it would be proper or upheld, but you need to be aware if one is issued and what effect it could have on you.
Sure. From a business practice, Adam, how are you guys treating your storage auction process now?
Again, given the risk that you heard from both Mark and Joe, we're not doing any of it, whether it's PR, legislative, or however you want to look at it. It's all suspended. We're not doing it. Auction, eviction, it's just not happening. It's all suspended until further notice.
Now, so you say till further notice. Have you guys put any kind of a timeline, that you're looking out to? I know that I believe it's, Joe, you said the executive order expires June 19th. I don't know, have you put anything on the calendar to say, okay, look, as of July 1st, we're gonna start this, or is it just too early to tell?
I personally think it's too early to tell. And just like Mark talked about these new ordinances that have been introduced to the New York City Council that are up for review right now, which could prolong the moratorium on these lien sales and evictions in particular. I think you got to take it week by week and keep on top of the news. And we don't have anything scheduled at this point, which is why we're really focusing on an AR collection program to try to manage the people who may not be paying, but nothing on the calendar related to evictions, lien sales, and so on.
So you talk about the term collection and AR management. I mean, I assume you, like most of the operators I've spoken to during these times. I mean, from that perspective, it's still pretty much business as normal. I mean, we still have the right to collect the occupancy charges that are due us, and we're following our own guidelines on how we're contacting and reaching out to customers. Is that still stand pat for you, Adam?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything you would do regularly is still in place. We still mail out monthly invoices, and the vast majority of customers, perhaps 85 to 90%, are still in good standing, continue to pay their bill, and we have no issues with. But putting together a plan for the growing AR, and we certainly saw the number of customers who stopped paying or couldn't make full payments increase since the pandemic started, around the beginning of March. So we put special procedures in place. You really should identify what tools you have, waiving late fees, short-term discounts, payment plans, identify what you've already done to these customers, let them know. Again, it's about communication. Let them know you've suspended rate increases, you're not conducting auctions, and you want to talk through their situation and use the tools. We've also using a few new tools that we put together, an abandonment agreement, which lets people voluntarily abandon the unit with property in it, so we can get them out of the unit and get the bad debt off the books. And we also have our a vacate agreement, and you don't want to use your typical vacate agreement that may refer to the auction process, since auctions and evictions in that way aren't permitted. But if they voluntarily agree to vacate an empty room, you may want to, I would suggest making a modified vacate agreement. So using these tools, the abandonment agreement, a vacate agreement, into the existing things you already have could really help manage your AR situation.
So Joe, throughout our industry, throughout the state, we have single store operators with 150 to 200 units to big time operators. What kind of guidance can you give them as far as their collection efforts? And the rent is due to the operator. So based on what Adam was saying and some of his practices, any guidance you would want to give there?
Some of the things that I've suggested to my clients, whether it be a large or a small one, is to be understanding, but at the same respect, understand you have a mortgage payment to make at the end of the month. One thing, Adam, and I agree with Adam, is in certain situations, if you have a long-standing client or customer, I should say, who's having difficulty paying, offer them a 10% discount. I know that in certain situations where we've had people who were delinquent for several months, we've offered them a 50% discount to leave, to vacate their unit. That's been actually very successful with some of my clients. We've offered deferment plans with upfront payment, upfront payment of 50% and defer the end. The problem you run into with the deferment plans is people are starting to realize deferring my rent means it's just all going to come due at one point, and at that point, I'm not going to be able to pay it. I mean, it's just the reality of it. So people are starting to push back on the deferment plans, and they'd like a discount. If you're in a position to give somebody, say, a 5 or 10% discount to get the rental payment, you're typically in a better position than to them say, I just can't pay it, and you're not getting any money.
So let's just talk a little bit about what's happening around the state from the legal perspective and the court. So what are we seeing? Any activity? What's going on with the courts right now in New York State, Mark?
Very dynamic situation. It is changing day by day. As I said, right now, supposedly there's going to be some type of opening tomorrow or the day after. They haven't announced what it is. Some of the courts have sent out invites for the lawyers to sign up for Skype for Businesses because they plan on moving to that platform. But it's not up and running in any large scale at all. And I've not seen any indication why we should believe that it's just going to change instantly tomorrow. Even the court system itself has a coronavirus hotline to talk about the situation and let you know where they are on a day by day. So right now we're just waiting and seeing what their next steps are. New York has not had an easy transition. Other states never stopped. The federal courts kept going instantly without any delay. But New York State has viewed this as a very large obstacle that they've been having trouble overcoming.
How about you, Joe, from your perspective? What are you seeing? What kind of activity or noise are you hearing coming out of the court system?
Well, I'll start with the first one as far as evictions. What we didn't mention is there's no you can't evict somebody right now. So the landlord-tenant aspect has essentially shut down with the exception of legal lockouts. So they're very quiet. The state courts, I agree with Mark, very slow. Basically, they've been shut down except for non-essential matters, and that's mostly family court and criminal matters. I've gotten similar emails that they're going to try and open it up in the next few days. I don't really see what they're opening up as far as from a practical standpoint. I mean, I've received a couple of calls and emails from judges to set up conference calls to try and settle cases. But beyond that, the notices that I've gotten, they're basically saying, work with your adversary, try and get discovery moving and whatnot. But as far as getting into the courts, I don't honestly see that you're going to be able to get into an actual courthouse until at least August. And as far as jury trials go, I don't know when that's ever going to start.
Gotcha. Okay. So we've kind of gotten through some of the more prevalent questions we've been getting, you know, as an association, as well as operators and attorneys and such. So I want to, next few we have, I think, are more generally related to, you know, how we're doing business during this pandemic time. So what are some of the things that we should be doing to protect our customers and creating the quote unquote social distancing? Mark, let me start with you on that one.
Everybody's answer to that always is follow the current CDC and governmental requirements. So let me just start by saying that meaningless statement, and you can search the web for hours to see if there's been any changes. Currently, the standard is social distancing, which means 6 feet. Businesses are going about it in different ways. Some are using marks on the floor where they would like their customers to stand. Others reposition display racks or other items around to create more flowing or natural looking barriers. Signs posted up. I think currently in New York, New Jersey, and many growing states at this point, masks are required, but yet you're not allowed to prohibit somebody from accessing your property if they're not wearing it. You can make an inquiry, you could offer them one, but you have to recognize there could be medical reasons that they don't have to disclose to you for not wearing one, and you're not allowed to exclude them based on that. Having hand sanitizer available, if you're able to even get it, that's a plus. That's something that businesses do. Another thing that's being done that isn't required is that some businesses are having different hours for people over 60 or disabilities or underlying conditions. That's another consideration if it's possible. But really, like I said, the legal answer is to follow CDC and governmental regulations and advisories.
Joe, anything you want to add to that from the attorney side, and then we'll go right into Adam to hear some of the neat things that they're out there doing.
Not really when it comes to protecting the customers. Obviously, as Mark said, social distancing, don't allow packs of 50 people coming in where they're going to congregate all over. You can, as Mark said, stagger the hours. I know some of my clients have to come in by appointment, so you have to call and say I'm coming in, so you can control the flow in and out. But beyond that, really, Mark covered everything.
So Adam, I think this one is really, geared towards the operator himself. So what are some of the things that you as at Manhattan Mini Storage are doing to help, give your customers this little sense of peace of mind here when it comes to the social distancing and, how it's affecting your operation?
Yeah, I'll go through a number of different things. Mark touched on a few of them already. It starts with communication to not just the customers, but the employees also about, what you're doing, how you're handling it, what the expectations are, signage on the door, maybe it's an email. If you have elevators, maybe a signage, additional signage near the elevator, make sure people don't crowd into elevators. We've communicated also, please only come if you have an essential visit, a real need to visit your storage unit. Personal protective equipment, PPE, obviously a big thing, and you heard a number of supply things mentioned by Mark. Masks, gloves, hand sanitizer, wipes, disinfectant spray. It's obviously very hard to get these items. We all know this. We're struggling to get toilet paper for our houses, and it's the same for our businesses to get these items. A lot of them are long lead times, so get your orders in. And some things like hand sanitizer, you have to get in bulk and then put in smaller containers and so on. Some other protections, you increase cleaning of lobbies, of course. A lot of you have probably been doing these things already. As we talk about the reopening is becoming a big thing, going to the next level. So do you hang up? I've seen some operators put up a large plexiglass barrier. You hang it with chains from the ceiling to give some, again, to help with the social distancing between customers and the employees. There's also smaller sneeze shields, what they're calling. We're using some of these. They're about 3 feet wide, 4 feet tall. They sit on a counter. They're pretty affordable. That could be an alternative for you to look into. The markers and stickers on the floor, I'm sure you've seen them at the supermarkets to keep people 6 feet apart. And for us, we're locking the lobby. Unless you have a reservation ahead of time, we're not letting you in the lobby. And that's really helped our employees feel more comfortable. And we know that people that are in the, who need to enter the lobby, they're calling us because they need to make a payment. We're encouraging online payment, but if they have to get in the lobby, they sort of have to have a real reason to come into the lobby. And that's been very helpful. Just a couple more things. COVID messaging on your website. If you have a website, of course, I think it's good to, again, let customers know what to expect. We're really encouraging online payments there. If you have that type of technology, do an online payment. Don't come in person. If you do have to come in person, don't use cash. Maybe you have a contact list, like where you can pay with your phone. Use those types of technologies if you can. And then again, moving forward with sort of, again, the reopening, which I mentioned before, we're looking at how do we make the process more contactless. So can you do an electronically signed OA and some of those other technologies, which, may take several months to implement, but I know the REITs are doing some of that already. So it's certainly something to consider in your pipeline down the future.
Thanks. Yeah, I think, you hit a couple of key terms there. I think communications to our employees as well as to our customers are really critical during this time. And we seem to be getting bombarded with news briefs and things like that, from the governors to the president to county executives. Everybody seems to be getting online or on TV. And I think making sure that and part of the reason that we're here today with this webinar is to share some practices that we found to be effective within our industry, within the state of New York. So the one thing that I, as the moderator, I wanted to pass along is there are some pretty good websites out there, and Eric with the NYSSA will share these with you as part of the webinar. There's one where you can actually sign up to get a daily update from the governor's office. There's one that you can get from the Empire State Development Corp that has been providing a lot of these guidance items for businesses, small businesses, large businesses, of some of the things that you can take into account that can help your customers feel a little more secure when they come in. So one of the things that we've been hearing in this time is the term essential service. So Mark, if you can kind of give us a little bit of a definition on what that essential business term means, and where we can, how we as a storage operator fit into that.
The guidance from the executive order itself illustrates what a difficult time it is to define an essential service or essential business. It goes on for pages. I would just summarize it as being medical related, not elective surgeries or procedures, pharmaceutical related, food related, utilities, and transportation. Those, I think, are the big categories. But like I said, if somebody wanted to go onto the EDC website, you'll see the specifics and the categories go on for numerous pages.
Joe, anything you want to help fill in here?
No, I mean, I quite honestly, there's some obvious ones that the Empire State Development Committee has, and there's some that you should sort of scratch your head. But if you really want to know what they are, Mark hit it on the head. They're all listed on the ESD website. In fact, March 28th, they put out a new list of who is actually essential and non-essential. So you can go right on there and look.
So we were talking a little bit earlier today in the discussions over collections and denying access. So Adam, when customers are coming to you and they're saying they're unable to pay their bill, whether it's paid in full or whatever it might be, how are you recommending, or how are you guys handling some of these situations?
Yeah, again, I think Joe used the best word earlier, flexibility. You need to be flexible, and it's challenging because you don't want to give everything away to every customer, but you really want to deal with them individually, which is why we're proactively outreaching to customers, or when they come to us, it's a conversation about what their hardship is, what their situation is, and it's a judgment call. There's no scientific way to deal with it. And again, some of the things I already mentioned, waiving the late fees, certainly, like Joe had mentioned, also applying a short-term discount, a real discount to their account is often appreciated and gets people over the hump. And then people who may be in more difficult situations. So then maybe we go to a payment plan, a partial payment rider, and do things a little more formally that way. And again, in the worst case scenarios, people that know they won't be able to pay or really in dire straits, perhaps we try and push for a vacate agreement or abandonment agreement if we really need to. But that's really a last case resort. I mean, our goal is really retention. We want to keep occupancy up. We all know that replacing high dollar, longer term, higher value customers with low dollar new customers is not desirable at all. So if we can find any way to retain them and be flexible, which may include writing off some portion of their debt, again, on a case-by-case basis, but that flexibility does need to be there.
Joe, Adam mentioned a couple of key words there as far as riders and agreements, and I think it's really apropos if you are going to enter into or try to formalize an agreement with a customer on a case-by-case basis, and we want to have them, kind of have the commitment of an agreement to come back and pay us the balance or whatever the deal might be. What do you recommend as far as having a payment plan, in a payment plan agreement and getting it signed, and what are the major components so that we can protect ourselves and whatever rights we might have as this pandemic gets lifted?
Well, I mean, the obvious one being that you should list what they're going to pay, how long they're going to pay it, what the actual payments will be over a given month. Pre-COVID, I had a pretty standard one. The consequence of not making a payment or defaulting was that you were going to forfeit the property to the owner. So it might be a little harsh to put into a payment plan now, but it's certainly something to think about. If you're going to give somebody a large discount, then you should be getting something back in return. I don't think a lot of people will really push back if you're going to say, well, you pay me 50%, but if you fail on a payment, you'll forfeit the property. One thing that I get pushback from some clients, and some clients say that's a great idea, is the concept of giving a payment plan to a company, not an individual, where they're paying like 50%, and then they'll, at the end of 3 months, they'll make the remainder. The fear that I always have is that at the end of those 3 months, it's a company, so they're going to say, well, sorry, I can't make the remainder of the payments, and they were smart enough to remove their property from the unit. So what I've suggested in those situations, if you really have that fear, is offer them, the big discount, but say somebody has to personally guarantee the payment of this at the end of this, so I know you're not just going to walk away from everything and I'm going to be stuck with no money. Again, some say it's a great idea, some say it's a little harsh. Personally, I think it's a reasonable, and if it's presented in a proper way, it's not going to come across as unduly harsh, since you're taking a big hit on the 50%.
So we talked about some of the amounts and things like that. Mark, I mean, is there an amount of a partial payment that, in theory, a customer could make that would then take them out of the lien process? Or, if we have these agreements, I mean, how do we want to ensure that we protect, the rest of the clauses in our occupancy agreements?
When I do a payment plan, I generally put in there that it's not altering any of the rights or remedies under the occupancy agreement. The only thing it's altering is the amount that's due and the dates that those payments are due. You have to be very careful about that to preserve your rights. Obviously, if you're doing a payment plan under these terms, you want to show that there's a favorable reason for the person that's not related to a threat such as eviction or lien sales. So, and the best way to do that is to have a discount.
Adam, issues you're finding with customers and entering into payment agreements? I mean, pushback, acceptance. What are you finding in general?
Yeah, we're finding it's pretty straightforward. Our agreement isn't particularly complicated, even though we heard the legal advice. It's a one-page agreement. I think it protects both the customer and the business. For otherwise there really is no other place where you're documenting the reduced, this payment plan. So I think it's good for both parties. Our particular one of the key elements of our partial payment plan, it also indicates that we will no longer add late fees to their account. So I think that's another key element in this time period, to have agreement on what's happening with that component. We haven't used it a lot. Again, it's just one of the tools in our toolbox, but it's been effective, and it's a smart way to have the written documentation for both parties.
Okay. All right. So we're kind of getting close to the end of our hour here together. So I just wanted to make sure that we are able to address a couple of the questions that the folks have been submitting through the chat feature, and I will turn back to Eric for some of those. But I guess from the panel, I mean, on the discussions we had today, if there's one thing that you would like the audience to take away from this session, what would that be? And Mark, you're on the top of the screen, so I'll start with you.
Well, as we all know, these are unusual times with unprecedented protections for everybody but the landlord. So I would say be flexible, be compassionate, and if you have a concern whether or not an intended action is even permitted and you want to avoid paying a lawyer, don't do it.
Adam, how about yourself?
The best advice to know is it's dynamic. It changes every single day. The advice that you may hear today could be completely different even tomorrow with a new executive order or a new public policy. So just stay on top of things, be flexible. We talk about flexibility, with the customers. We need to be flexible with ourselves, and it's just a constantly changing environment, and just be prepared to pivot at any moment.
Okay. Joe?
I'm just going to use the word that everyone's used, flexibility. You have to go with the flow on this. I mean, everything changes day to day. I mean, we get new orders day to day. You have to work with your customers, so you don't end up having zero occupancy at the end, but you also have to realize that, you can only give so much at certain points.
Okay. So at this point, I think we do have some time for some questions from our members that are in the webinar. So Eric, if you'd like to take back the control here, we can try to get through a few of those.
Sure. First question, should we stop calling what we charge customers rent? Would it be better to call it something like storage fees? That way people would stop associating storage units with apartment or office space rules during the pandemic.
Okay, interesting question. Mark, what are your thoughts on that?
Everybody already has an occupancy agreement, already been labeled. Might as well stay consistent with what you've called it and what the relationship is with the customer. Some of them call it rent, some of them call it storage fees. There's all different charges, but it's already in your agreement with your customer.
Joe?
No, I mean, that's the answer. I mean, most of my agreements use the term occupancy charges. The reality is it's the same thing, rent or occupancy charge. Monthly occupancy charge.
Okay. So no real benefit. I mean, obviously that's something maybe we consider if you don't have it coined that way in your occupancy agreements going forward, it might be something that you want to take a look at, but from a public perspective, probably one and the same.
It's not going to change the rights anyway.
Yeah. Next question you have, Eric?
We have a tenant who has sadly passed away from COVID-19. We are familiar with the family members as they have all been in and out of the facility in unit with the deceased, but none of them have been listed as having access to the unit. The wife and one son have key fobs to enter the facility and keys to the unit. If and when they vacate the unit, do I need to demand a death certificate?
That's a lot of information in one question, and Joe's still pondering it, but I'm going to start with you anyway, Joe.
This question you're asking really has nothing to do with the current situation we're in. If you know that a tenant has passed away, then you cannot give somebody else access to the unit until that person presents letters of administration or some other order from the court giving them the right to access the unit. So it's a very simple answer on that respect.
Mark?
I agree completely. It doesn't change due to the times we're under. When a tenant dies, there are certain required actions, and those don't sound like they're currently being taken.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's go for our next question there, Eric.
Would you reduce the number of collection calls made in a given month?
Okay, so I'm going to start with you on that one, Adam. What's your feelings on that? I'm assuming that means number of collection calls to the same tenant, not overall collection calls.
Yeah, so I guess we look at a couple different ways. So we use a third party when we move people to collections. We've suspended those collections calls as part of the process. And just in terms of like for day-to-day people that are behind on their rent, right now we're just doing one phone call to each tenant. We've made, it's basically just a spreadsheet of all of our customers that owe us money. And each location is reaching out to those customers. And again, like I stressed before, having a conversation with them. But what we do next step, I think we'll probably move to perhaps an email. Again, we're trying to facilitate communication, but we're trying to be nice about it. We're trying to get the conversation started. I think that's the goal. By if you continually, if people feel like they're being threatened or harassed in some way, I think those people are going to turn you off and you won't hear from them. So I think you need to have sensitivity in how you go about the process. Patience.
Yep. Yeah, I think you've touched on a couple of things there as far as threatening and harassing, and we're starting to see some of that language coming from some of the government officials and trying to protect rights of tenants and so forth. Not necessarily self-storage, but more residential. Mark, I mean, guidance on frequency and what do you do if the story just doesn't change from the customer?
I'm sure there's many stories that aren't going to change for the better as we get further into this, and you have to accept it. I mean, you're not in a position right now to strong arm, make threats, follow through with self-help at the moment. You certainly can't go into court and evict. So yes, I would be cautious. I would tread lightly. I'd do a lot of listening, try and work with them, but don't be viewed as harassing. Be compassionate. Listen.
Gotcha. Joe, if there's anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I mean, one thing I would strongly recommend to some of the larger operators who give their staff a script, avoid the script at this point. You need to have some compassion. You need to be working with these people and listen, as Mark said, listening to them. I think the ultimate goal is to try and work out a payment plan if somebody really has no money. So at least you have some income coming in.
Okay, great, thank you. Eric, next question.
So a two-part question. If we do not have an auction that will end any upcoming charges for the tenant, we will be increasing what the tenant owes going forward with additional rent and late fees. Is this fair for the past due tenant that could not even pay prior to COVID-19? And the second part of the question, we will not be following our lease agreement. What will be the expectations for tenants to follow our lease if we do not?
Okay, so I think the first part there was, I mean, tenants are getting into a position where Joe alluded to earlier, one of the conversations where they're accruing so much that they might not, there just might be a point of no return for them. And then, if we're not enforcing the terms of our occupancy agreements, how do we protect ourselves? So let's start with you on that one, Joe.
Well, that sort of gets to the point where I discussed putting some remedy, for lack of a better term, in your agreements you work out. So typically, pre-COVID, and I guess now you would have to do this also, is you put the payment plan in effect, but if you don't pay by a certain date or you miss a payment, then they would forfeit the property of the units to the owner. I probably wouldn't have them forfeit the property during the current situation. I'd wait till after the order for evictions is lifted, but I would certainly have something in the agreement that on X date, if a payment is missed, they'll forfeit all property to the owner, something of that nature.
Thank you. Eric, how about one more question?
Sure. Would you send any balance due to collections during a vacate at this time, or simply write it off as a loss?
Adam, how about let's start from an operational standpoint there. 'Cause I mean, I think that really, differs. I don't know if there's a legal take on that. I think that has to do with more of a preference to the business operator.
Yeah, I think, it's probably someplace in between. Like I said before, we're not sending it to collections right now, but, it's still on the books as about, as an AR, a balance due to us. And at some point, a business decision is made to either write down that debt. Again, just like Joe's encouraging, like you have to be flexible with these customers. If you can write it off, and if you think they're going to turn the corner of it, you can keep that occupancy, keep some amount of income coming in, great. But at some point, you'll have to eventually down the road, right? You're going to have to either get rid of that customer, write that bad debt off, and perhaps decide at that point to submit it to collections. But again, I would hold off on that now and try to, again, come to some arrangement with the customer.
And I think from a business perspective, I mean, the type of operation and business entity you are, I think that, there's a lot of different variations there. And the guys we have here, I don't think would consider themselves tax attorneys first. So I think that's one where there obviously are tax implications for an individual owner operator. So I think that's a conversation that some of the folks may want to have with their accountant or something like that when it comes to bad debt and writing things off, and when the timing would be most appropriate for that. So I think we still have time for one more question, Eric, if you can get it in.
Sure. Let's see. Unrelated to COVID-19, there's been an increasing need to install BDA systems in our facilities. It's up to the cities or municipalities, fire marshal, whether or not one is required. My question is, do you think a costly BDA system would be required for life safety at a self-storage facility?
I'm not sure that I've heard what that is or what that requirement is before. I don't know if anybody has heard what the BDA requirement is.
I'm not familiar with it. I just think you got to look at whatever your local city or municipality is requiring. I mean, my situation may not apply to others. Being in New York City, we have pretty extensive fire life safety systems, and we, when the facility's open, we're compliant with that code.
Okay, well, I think our time has kind of come, and I certainly on behalf of the association want to really thank our panelists here today, Mark, Joe, and Adam. I think they gave you some tremendous insight into the topics of the day and where there is a lot of gray area, and I think we'll all walk away agreeing that there is probably still some gray area. And that we want to continue to be smart operators, smart business people, and really stay on top of the news of the day. As Adam mentioned, it is changing almost daily, certainly if not weekly. I certainly want to thank the audience. Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your interest and your feedback and your participation in this. So I'm going to turn it back now to Eric from the NYSSA just for some housekeeping and parting words.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you, panelists, and thank you to all our participants today. As I mentioned at the beginning of the call, we will post this on our website at the beginning of next week. Any questions you have with regard to the webinar today can be sent to the nyselfstorage.org website. Thank you again. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.